Hello, everyone. This is episode 15 of the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I'm very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. And you know what? Pop culture stuff. Let's keep it going. I thought let's do an interesting one. Let's do Star Wars, but I want to take it a very interesting take because, okay,
Big topic.
Yes, but
massive amount of material to work with there.
but I think what's interesting about it is, okay, the revolutionary content is obviously there. You have a galactic empire and you have a rebellion that's trying to overthrow them because they're oppressive and all of that. But what's very interesting about it, so this is both in all three of its trilogies. So in the prequels, you have the rise of a fascist dictatorship or a galactic empire. Yeah. The original trilogy, you have a rebellion standing against a fascist galactic empire. Yeah. And then in the sequel, the rebellion not being quite successful and that fascist regime rises again. And it's basically a resistance trying to battle that fascist regime.
Yeah.
So because there's that almost obsession with fighting fascism, naturally it's made me think, well, can this be interpreted as an anti-fascist tale or go in the lines of Antifa?
Right. And yeah, I think it's a good question or a good starting point to talk about things. And I know that you've written down Mark Bray's The Anti-Fascist Handbook, which is a great resource, I think, for anyone who's trying to get their head around what anti-fascism or Antifa really is. And I think a really good lesson from that book and what Mark Bray tries to teach us is that anti-fascism is like a yin and a yang thing. Anti-fascism, Antifa, does not exist in and of itself. It is simply a reaction to fascist organization. So without fascism, you have no Antifa. So without the evil empire, you have no resistance. And so if you want to look at this from an anti-fascist kind of analogy, or if really this is what is actually being said in the subtext or the underlying story here, is that they're really commenting on, yes, the fascists rising, the development of that in the prequels, as you said, and then the original plot, they've kind of taken hold, and then you have that anti-fascist resistance, and then you have like almost them rising again, and then that anti-fascist response to that. I think you could take it very broadly and holistically from the standpoint that this is one large anti-fascist kind of tale, because you don't have one without the other, and that's very much a big theme, I think, in the Star Wars story. The resistance is there because of the existence of the evil empire.
Yeah, because I guess that's the whole point, like both in Mark Bray's book, as well as like within the Star Wars stories themselves, is that the resistance or the rebellion, it like the reason why it becomes a part and the reason for the struggle and everything is because this oppressive regime comes about, and the fascist connotations are pretty obvious. I think everyone knows that the use of the foot soldier, referring to them as stormtroopers, which has a direct reference to Hitler's army. You can't get any more direct than that.
And even like their uniform, like the shape of their helmets and stuff like that. Pretty iconically, a Nazi soldier's helmet, but in like, I guess a space age take on that, with the indentation and the way the helmet flows down from the back and stuff like that. It's like even in like its literal, like it's aesthetic, and in the way that they actually described, it's not subtle at all. Really, it's not subtle. And so I think there's, I guess, a lot of kind of importance in drawing those literal or those really obvious kind of clues from the story of the rise of fascism as well. So like in Europe, you have the development of fascism coming primarily or originally out of Europe, out of Italy specifically, and then it being developed and I guess refined or perfected in a way in Germany. And you have obviously at the time in Germany, as well as you had a similar arrangement going on in Italy, a takeover of a republic or a representative form of government system. You have fascist takeovers on a political spectrum or in a political arena. I'm not talking about physical or armed takeovers here. I'm talking about legitimate political takeovers, through, elections and party membership. And they end up coercing and co-opting their republics of the day, which is exactly what happens to the story. You see in the prequels that, that famous line by Princess Amidala, and this is how the republic dies or democracy dies with the sound of applause and stuff like that. Like the correlations are, like we've said before, are not subtle at all. And so you can follow that development through the Star Wars kind of storyline, which is exactly how it played out in Europe. You have the rise of fascist dictatorships on mainland Europe that then seek to, control the galaxy, as it were, and they have weapons of mass destruction, and they have fleets and military techniques and everything that are just well in advance of their I guess their neighboring powers at the time. And so they're able to take a strong, like a stranglehold on mainland Europe, the Eurasian continent, which is kind of like the main parts of the galaxy, I guess, apart from the outlying areas. And then you have this kind of defeat of fascism to a certain extent, which is where you have the middle part of the story, the Star Wars story, the originals from the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
And then there's that resurgence that you were talking about before. And that's the real thing about fascism, is that it never went away.
Yeah.
And that's a really important point. I think a lot of people don't understand is that, Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, okay, fine, they might have been defeated by the Allies and the Soviets and stuff like that. They were dismantled and they never came back in that form, but fascism survived as a cultural element, as an ideal, just like the empire finds its new legs and a new leader and all that sort of stuff. And they raised basically the evil empire again. And again, a resistance movement is required to kind of counterpose that, to resist that rising again, and which is what happened post World War II in Europe, in America, in lots of places in the world, wherever there were skinhead movements, neo-Nazis, fascist risings in cultural forms, in groupings, there was their antithesis, their opposite, Antifa. And so that's I think like the sequel, more or less, is how fascism morphed into something different and how that was opposed by its lifelong opponent,
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the sequel trilogy, because I think if you don't have the sequel trilogy, saying that this can be viewed in an Antifa lens, I feel like you can be accused of drawing a long bow. But the fact that the sequel
Yeah,
trilogy is there, and that the old empire rises again, and um, uh, they basically the resistance has to come back and fight the good fight once again,
yeah,
and find the new Jedi's, or Rey in this case, and rally behind the Jedi's. Is
mm,
That's what reinforces to me that this is an anti-fascist tale, because it's the reoccurrence of this fascist regime that um, is the main story that we're drawn into. And it's this fight, this resistance fight.
yeah,
And I think because of that, um, it kind of parallels real life in a certain way. And what I mean by that is, I want to take it back to what another point that you said is that, well, fascist regimes, or at least this kind of fascist mentality, it never truly goes away, which is basically Antifa's main point, is that we are the watchers on the wall kind of thing, as in
yeah,
we will make sure that when fascism rise again, we'll be there to beat it to death, basically.
yeah,
And with regimes, or at least political parties, popping up, like for example in Sweden recently, a populist right-wing party. I have heard rumors that they have fascist tendencies, or at least they grew out of a fascist group.
yeah,
And this is one of the Nordic countries. This is known to be one of the most progressive countries, well, part of the progressive countries in the world. They've apparently, well, supposedly they've elected a fascist, or at least a fascist aligned party.
mm,
And that dives into the Star Wars mentality of, well, fascism is always dormant. And, we must be ready to fight the good fight when we need to.
yeah, yeah,
Brothers in arms, sisters in arms, rise up and fight the fascist regime. Otherwise, it'll get away from us, and we'll be living under a dictatorship.
yeah.
And I found it very interesting.
Mm. And like in terms of always being there to respond to fascism and things like that, I think the correlations can also be drawn into like the middle part of the Star Wars franchise with the original episodes. You have you have a well planned and well trained resistance at that point. So you have basically fleets and armies of rebel soldiers
Mm.
that are willing to fight and ready to fight for the cause. But by the time you get to the sequels, you basically have this very diminished, if not completely ineffectual, resistance force and very outlying resistance characters who put up the main fight against this rise again of this evil empire that's a lot more coordinated and well established in its mission and its abilities. And that is truly reflected, I think, in the World War II scenario, where you have, like I was saying before, the well-established fascist alliance that is well supplied and well trained, but you also have well supplied to an extent and well trained Allied forces and Soviet forces that fight against the fascist movement.
Mm.
But then post World War II, when fascism kind of crumbles a bit, but it has its resurgence, it is still potentially a lot more, if not organized, resourced
Mm.
better than the anti-fascist movements. And the anti-fascist movements have to come out of the underground to try and fight fascism in whatever form it takes. And that's exactly the story of like Ray and Finn and all that sort of stuff. They are very underground kind of figures that end up having to take this massive burden among like on themselves to try and resist this much larger fascist organization and presence, or this imperial power and presence. And they have to go on this massive journey of discovery to find themselves and really slot themselves into the resistance movement, which is really on its last legs. And they keep on hammering that home throughout, I guess, the whole sequel kind of trilogy. So I think it's really interesting how they've continued to try and tie that story to kind of the real kind of narrative that follows the rise and the fall, and then the rise again, or the rebirth of fascism through the 20th century into the 21st century even, because, you know, fascism, or Antifa anyway, has been big in the press, like especially, you know, a few years ago when Trump was in power. Antifa was this massive, you know, kind of problem that needed to be dealt with. And like it seemed like it came out of nowhere, almost, right? Like Ray or like Finn and like many of the resistance characters, they seem to appear out of nowhere, but they have a long history and they're really forged in opposition to the existence of their antithesis and the evil empire, a fascist movement.
Well, this isn't exactly a Star Wars movie, but I have actually been watching the new series called Andor. And what's very interesting about Andor is that it's I'm not exactly sure when in the timeline it's set, but I'd imagine it's probably set very much closer to episode 4 than rather than episode 3. And because very much the Galactic Empire is in the height of its bureaucracy, and you're very much shown the inner workings of how the Galactic Empire works. And you actually get to know like basically a jeweler that knows the upper ranks of the imperial officers, as well as a senator. But what's very interesting about this senator and the jeweler is that they are very integral figures in the rebellion. And they're playing a very high stakes game where, like, any move they make, if they make the wrong move, or if there's, you know, one person that isn't 100% part of their rebellion, like that could spell the end of everything, and everyone they know of will might be killed. Yeah. And I think what was very, very interesting about that is when you kind of read Mark Bray's book, is that, yeah, we get this idea that, oh, Antifa's just kind of sprang up from the ground and it's a relatively new phenomenon. But when you actually read Mark Bray's book, is that no, when there was fascism, there was always anti-fascism. And despite there being this militantness with fascism, there was also an equal militant group that were anti-fascists, that even if they weren't successful, they would always rise again. Like I think, again, people might think that I'm drawing a long bow here, but I think Snook, who's basically the Palpatine figure in the sequel trilogy, is that he always, I think he says one of these lines that, oh, well, when darkness descends, light rises to meet it. He says a line like this, and I think it kind of ties into that theme of, well, whenever there's fascism, there's always anti-fascism. And
Yeah.
these two are always just going to butt heads because
Mm.
that's just how that eternal war works.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. And like, if you can draw some more correlations, taking it then back, I guess you would say, to the prequel trilogy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember exactly what they're called. I think they refer to themselves as separatists, but those kind
Yes.
of alien kind of creatures that control the droid armies. But they
Mm.
also refer to themselves as unions, right? They're like trade unions or something like
Yes,
that.
they either refer to themselves as the banking guild, but I
Yeah,
think they no the Trade Federation.
Trade Federation.
Yeah.
I would like to draw a correlation there or try an analogy with what's going on with some type of trade union kind of movement there. And it's not like just a separatist movement like you'd have like separatists in the southern states of America that were trying to secede from or to get themselves differentiated from like the northern states and stuff like that. I would like to think that if you look at it from a fascist story kind of perspective and a timeline, before there was actual consolidated Nazi power and like fascism in Europe, in Italy and Germany, there was all out brawls and fights in the streets all the time between these rising fascist parties and the anti-fascists, who at that point were basically leftists or socialists, but especially they were people from the union movement, because fascism as a kind of where it's come from is a definite reaction to the working class movement. And its goal originally was, it was used by the capitalist classes to suppress worker movements. And so if you have this kind of like separatist army, which you end up finding out, you think they're the evil characters all the way through like the prequels kind of thing, these droid kind of machine making separatists or whatever they're called, these trade somethings. I
Mm.
think there's like a union kind of they're trying to evoke this idea of these kind of union-esque kind of characters. But like if that's really what they were doing with the storyline, then it's the parallel to real life is absolutely uncanny, because they weren't really evil fascists at this point,
Mm.
because they hadn't really taken power and they weren't the empire yet, and like taken, and they didn't have like a dictatorship running. It was just this rivalry between what would one day become the fascist movements that would overtake
Mm.
Europe and the union movements. And it was just like socialists or original type socialists versus the national socialists.
Mm.
They were fighting each other for supremacy, basically. Who was going to take over here? And obviously, the capitalist classes, the elites of the time, were going to back fascism every day of the week, because if you're a capitalist, right, or you're part of the ruling classes and you're
Mm.
controlling the economy, who are you going to trust? A union movement that's basically looking for workers' autonomy and are going to try and make economic decisions in the interests of the masses and the working class? Or are you going to trust someone who potentially has dictatorial power over their party and like needs your industry and your capitalist programs in order to fund their armies and their larger visions? They're not going to get rid of you. They're not going to challenge you, and they might help crush the workers' movement for you at the same time. So you have this marrying up of the ruling elite of Europe with fascism, and that's how you get the rise of Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy and the Nazi Party in Germany. And so developing that even more, the prequel is a big story about incompetent elites. So your
Mm.
Galactic Republic
Yeah.
and all its senators, and people might not like this, but incompetent Jedis. they were tasked with controlling and, keeping order and balance in, like, the galaxy and stuff like that. And they failed miserably. They were so heavily clouded by their own kind of clout, and they became so audacious. They couldn't see the fascist uprising coming up from underneath that was about to take over and basically end their entire order. And so you have a group of incompetent elites with a rising fascist movement, and that's exactly what spells the rise of fascism in Europe, and the first time that we see this massive takeover.
Well, you do raise a really good point, because incompetence, or at least actually, I think incompetence is a good way of phrasing it, or maybe gross negligence, because let's go with the big moment in the prequels, execute Order 66. See, the thing is, like, let's look at
people who are familiar. What's execute Order 66?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm getting to that. I'm getting to that. So, let's go to movie 2 before we go to movie 3. So, movie 2, or episode 2, Obi-Wan Kenobi is basically following the lead of trying to find this character Jango Fett, who's a bounty hunter, and he ends up on this planet called Kamino, and he goes into it, and these Kaminoans, Camoans, I'm not sure how to say that precisely, but these people, native people of the planet, they're really good cloners. And basically, when he arrives, it's like, oh, Master Jedi, thank God you finally come. Well, we thought you weren't going to come. And you find out that an entire army has been created for the Republic. And Master Cyberdius, which is a master of the Jedi Order that's been dead for 10 years, has apparently asked the natives of Kamino to make them an army. And the Jedis are like, yeah, this is kind of weird, but just at that moment, the droid army kind of pops up on Naboo, so they don't particularly question it. So, or at least, well, the droid army is an immediate threat, so they kind of don't question it, and they kind of take advantage of the situation and roll with it. Now, let's roll over to episode 3. Now, they've not questioned that this army is just cropped up just in the nick of time so they can start this epic battle with the droids. But what they don't know is that the clone army, so these brothers in arms that are fighting amongst the Jedis, they have inhibitor chips in them, and basically Palpatine can, on the flick of a switch, can basically say to them, hey, I want you to kill anyone for me. And what execute Order 66 is him turning around to the clone soldiers and saying, the Order 66, which is the Jedi Order, I want you to kill them all. Every youngling, every Padawan, every master. And because they've got the inhibitor chips in them, you see this massive sequence in episode 3 of them just killing everyone.
It's wiping out the Jedi Order, basically.
Yeah. And that goes back to the gross negligence and incompetence. Like, even, like, obviously Obi-Wan says, like, oh, this is kind of weird, and everyone else is like, oh, this is kind of weird, but then they kind of roll with it because they obviously immediately want to put out the fire that's in front of them. But it's weird that nobody's like, hey, okay, well, we've got this army, that's great, but we need to find out how Master Cyberdius got permission to create this army. Did he even consult the Jedi Council?
How did we get here in the first place? And is this acceptable? Is this an acceptable course of action for us to be following? And is it better than any other alternative? Should we be sacrificing, the integrity that comes with a high post, like being charged with keeping the galaxy safe, and then accepting that there's just an army at your disposal now? And especially there's all this conversation in the movie about with Jedis and stuff, they're constantly referring in the prequels and stuff about, how you can't trust politicians and all that sort of stuff. And, Palpatine is just a politician like anyone else, and you have to be careful throughout the whole movie. And then you can see the slow rise to him being given executive power and executive control over this army. And the other elites, the people that are outside of the Senate, this Jedi Order that's charged with a certain level of responsibility, is completely powerless in the face of any of that to do anything. And if their real mission is yet to provide balance to the galaxy and guard kind of its stability, then they've lost that before they even realize, once he's figured out a way to gain executive power and executive control. And that mirrors completely, like to a T, with the rise of fascism in Germany. Like, it wasn't like fascism in Germany wasn't like this kind of armed takeover thing, like it's kind of mythed to be. It's definitely not that sense. There was no like, all right, we're going to storm the government and take over. They did it like legitimately. And even like the other political parties in Germany at the time, they were just too unorganized to resist. They weren't even seeing it really for what it was. And they didn't even, they didn't put up any struggle to try and maintain it. They did deals with the Nazi party, and the Nazi party kind of, like, don't get me wrong, it showed like presence. Like, it ended up, coming and parading in the streets and stuff like that, but it wasn't a violent takeover. And they muscled their way in, and the rest is kind of history, which is exactly what it is in the prequels into the main part of the story, or the original part of the story. The rest is kind of history. And then when you pick up later, it's in the midst of this kind of massive resistance struggle against this well-established fascist regime. And so, I think it's very interesting how they've made all these kind of very direct references to the actual history of fascism and anti-fascism throughout the world in the 20th century. It's quite, on deeper reflection, it's very, very interesting how they've pulled it off, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of the reason why it's, while people might see the sequel trilogy as a run back to the old tropes of what made Star Wars famous, I think it's actually integral that the First Order exists in the sequel trilogy. I think that is integral to prove that there are Antifa undertones to the Star Wars universe in general. Because, one trilogy story about fascism, okay, that's a story. Two, you can say that's a coincidence. But a third, one after the other, then you have to say that they've doubled down and say that that's an integral part or theme within the story itself.
Yeah, but I don't think they did it very well, though, in the sequels. I think they made fascism, or the rebirth, the renaissance of fascism, to be bigger than what it was. On a scale of fascism to anti-fascism, I don't think fascism is as big as it previously had been in mainland Europe during World War II, or the lead up to World War II. And so to have the sequels where you have the First Order that's almost as big as the Empire, or has even more power almost, because it has more destructive capability, which is what I think they're making a big, they make a big part of the storyline in the sequel, that you're like, you thought the Death Star was bad, check this bad boy out, kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say before, like, they have a planet destroyer that in one shot destroys about 4 or 5 planets, including the, actually, if I'm not mistaken, they take out Coruscant.
Yeah. So they really double down on this like kind of republic or democratic crushing element of a fascist kind of takeover. And I think they are a bit overzealous with that. They take it a little bit too far, because the fascist kind of rebirth in reality hasn't been as dramatic as that. I don't believe. It's been very underhanded and been done in the shadows. There's been plenty of fascism since then, but it's always been actually fascist takeovers that have been, supported by the CIA all over, like, South America and stuff like that, in order to make sure that communism and like socialist kind of governments don't take a hold in America's backyard, which is like, this massive kind of irony and paradox in itself, democratic free country spreading freedom by supporting fascist takeovers all around their neighboring countries and stuff like that. But let's not go there.
Though you do raise a good point, though. I think it would have been very interesting if they took a Noam Chomsky, like, it would have been ballsy, but like take a Noam Chomsky. Yeah,
if they weren't like, I think you hit the nail on the head before, when like Disney just couldn't resist rehashing the middle story again and being like, what would be better than the Death Star, man, the mega Death Star kind of thing. And they just couldn't resist doing that. And then you have to get in a plane and blow it up again kind of thing. But this time, it's not Han Solo and Luke Skywalker doing it. It's
Ray and Finn
and stuff like that. So like, they couldn't resist that, but like it would have been much more interesting if these kind of fascist this fascist rising was a little bit more clandestine and kind of guerrilla in its movement, and it was like slowly taking over again, like all over in different spots, and it was up to the resistance to fight that back and respond to each of those movements. But like you said, they have to go back to these kind of classic tropes and give the people what they wanted. And I think that's why people were disappointed with the sequels or the sequel trilogy, because it kind of just rehashed old things and didn't really invent anything new, which you would kind of expect of a narrative with the clout and the esteem of the Star Wars franchise. So I don't think they did the fascist story and the anti-fascist story a lot of justice with the sequel. It was just about like, hey, we got CGI now and we can make things go boom. So like there was a lot of that stuff going on. But like, why not? It's entertaining and things like that. So, but like, I think there is an important kind of lesson that they really try to tease out of all the Star Wars movies, and which is an important message in the anti-fascist movement at large, which is they always talk about hope. Like the whole resistance and the rebellion movement is based on the H word. They're always talking about like giving these nice little monologues about like hope and stuff like that. And wherever there's hope, there will be a form of resistance. And like you see that little like boy or slave kid that's got like the force, and they bring the groove to themselves, and they do the fascist kind of symbol. I think that's in. Is that actually in the?
Yes, that is in The Force Awakens.
Yeah,
he has a rebellion or a resistance ring, and then it's the very last scene. But yeah.
And that's a big part of the Antifa kind of story at large. It's one of their main motifs, that there is hope for a better world, a world in which fascism can't take a hold again. Because the biggest kind of I guess the lesson that Antifa will try to spread, while people might not agree with their means and their actions and stuff like that, their main message is, do you really want to risk another Hitler or another Mussolini? Do you really want to allow a fascist ideal to take hold again in any society and put so many lives and innocent people at risk for literally no reason apart from the fact that people are just like, ooh, should you really resist fascism? Is that like anti-free speech? Is that like anti-democratic by kind of resisting fascists and not letting them kind of have a platform to openly congregate and express themselves? And anti-fascists, like the resistance and the rebels in Star Wars, will just say, we don't care. We fight fascists because they are fascists. Like, we don't care. We rebel and we resist the evil empire because they are the evil empire. And so there is kind of this resistance for the sake of it. And the sake of it is based on hope, and hope that you can have a better world where you don't have to live in fear of there ever being another fascist uprising ever again.
Yeah, because really, at the end of the day, what are the three trilogies about? The prequel trilogy is the rise of Space Hitler. The middle trilogy, or the original trilogy, is the reign and the defeat of Space Hitler, and then the sequel trilogy is we have to kill Space Hitler again.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. Yeah. It's a really good summary. I wish you'd started the podcast like that, 4AS. And we're going to kill Hitler, Space Hitler 2.0. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And that's pretty much what it's all about, really. And so the whole movie is a reaction to that presence, which is, at the end of the day, all Antifa is, all that anti-fascism is. It doesn't exist without fascism. And I think that's a really important lesson. And like, I think there's a good parallel as well in the Star Wars movie to real life as well. Fascism doesn't exist on its own, and it hasn't existed kind of in history. While there have been dictatorships as such, fascist dictatorships, or fascism in a political sense, is only enabled by kind of these kind of liberal societies that we have now, these capitalist / democratic societies. So wherever those building blocks are there, like the Republic in Star Wars and representative democracies in Europe and stuff like that, and market economies, which is what we have today, that's where you get fascism. So if fascism can come out of that, and anti-fascism comes out of a response to fascism, you just have to take the chain back kind of thing and read back down to the original core. Wherever there is a liberal democracy and a market economy, there is the potential for fascism. And so fascism will never go away. And so in this galactic kind of universe of like the Star Wars galaxy and stuff like that, the Empire will never go away, potentially, as long as they keep on organizing the galaxy in whatever way that they do, as this big Senate and a galactic kind of galactic republic or whatever they call themselves. As long as they organize themselves in that way, there will always be an apparatus for some type of imperial takeover.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think you do raise a good point there. And well, it's really, I think what you're getting on you're at least alluding to is that well, that's how fascism rises in the real world, is populist right-wing populist thinking, and at least
the superstructure, the bureaucracy and and everything that's around as a result of democracies or liberal kind of democratic institutions, they just piggyback off that and take power from there. And they wouldn't be able to exist without that superstructure, that framework to bounce off or to take a hold of.
Yes.
And so you could argue without this galactic senate, there would never have been an empire. If they didn't all come together on Coruscant or wherever it was to form this nice senate and this overarching kind of political framework that like oversaw righteously or otherwise the galaxy, because you do have like a lot of discussion in certain parts of Star Wars when you hear them talking in the background, people that aren't part of the Senate and they don't like the galactic kind of federation or whatever it's called, because they don't think it's a good system and they think it's potentially dangerous and they don't want to be a part of it, the separatists.
Yeah.
And they have a good reason at the end of the day, because it's a framework that can be manipulated and overtaken by some type of fascist rule. They have very good reason. And that's exactly what happened in Germany and what happened in Italy. You had a political institution based on liberal democratic thinking or political institutions that were overrun and co-opted by fascist movements. And then as a result of that rise, then you have its opponent, Antifa.
Yes, and I guess what's interesting is that I think a majority of events that actually happen in Star Wars, like sure, the prequels, it was very heavily at Coruscant or basically within the Senate and everything, but very much the original trilogy as well as the sequel trilogy, it's always on some outer rim planet. It's not this isn't space Rome where it's we're having a stand-in for Octavian or a stand-in for Caesar where it's basically the political machinations within the Senate. No, it's usually some gunfight on Tatooine or a lightsaber sword fight on Mustafar. It's not it's not in the Senate. It's not in the courtrooms that make Star Wars. It's the fights. It's really the nitty gritty.
Yeah, on the remote kind of outposts of the empire. Are the only places that you could say are still free because they're outside of the realms of this superstructure.
Yeah,
which was co-opted by the empire. And even the empire don't have a full hold on these places, and that's why they're still a little bit wild, and that's where Antifa and the resistance exist to a large extent on the far outreaches of the galaxy, out of the radar and the reaches of the evil empire. And so, but like, yeah, I think there's a good message, or this, well, not a message, but there's good realization to take away there, that unfortunately, while we have liberal democracies, representative forms of governments, we will have fascism, and while we have fascism, we will have Antifa. So anyone out there who's skeptical about, why does Antifa exist and all that sort of stuff, well, until we revolutionize the system, we're going to need Antifa, and it's going to always be there. So strap yourselves in. It ain't going nowhere.
Okay. Well, I feel like we've had a pretty good discussion today, and we might leave it there. But before we do, you'll probably notice in the background, this is the synthwave art prompt. Pretty much wrote itself, where the prompt was a Star Wars battle between the fascist galactic empire and the Antifa rebellion. The Antifa rebellion. And it produced that. So again, I haven't yet released the latest episode, Synthwave Art. So I'll make sure in the next couple of weeks to release that on my Facebook page. But there's been some pretty good ones lately. And with that, everyone, we'll probably make that a wrap. So remember, everyone, to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll hand it over to you, Mr. E.
Thank you, 4IS. And to everyone out there, please remember, I am You are. We are a mystery.